Hi, I'm Lowell Gustafson. I'm from Villanova University in Villanova, Pennsylvania in the United States. I'm very grateful for the kind invitation from Dr. Wasim Dagrir and all the people here at the Tunisian Association for American Cultural Studies for their kind invitation to speak with you here. I'd also like to thank all of the leaders at the University of Sousse and elsewhere for their support of this conference and of TAACS. And a special word of thanks to all of the student organizers who made everything flow so smoothly. My topic here for our conference on heroes and villains in American culture, history, and politics is heroic protesters' villainous policy, the United States and Greater Israel. As has often been noted, we are watching the first real-time images of cultural and physical genocide that Israel is conducting and for which the United States is complicit. Those within the United States who have been protesting U.S. policy towards Greater Israel have been advocating for the government's actions that would correspond more closely to professed U.S. values and interests. They have alleged at risk and cost to themselves that U.S. policy has supported an apartheid state in Israel, war crimes and genocide in Gaza and Israel, wars on behalf of Israel in so many Middle Eastern countries. Many have alleged that the U.S. was involved in the recent overthrow of Assad in Syria in order to break Iran's supply lines to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to fragment an old adversary of Israel. They fear that current U.S. policy risks once again pulling the United States directly into a war against Iran on behalf of Israel. They discuss an explanation for why the U.S. acts against its own interests and professed values, and if there's anything that might bring its policy into line with its values. If the United States is bringing a liberal world rules-based international order to a close, and even if ethnic and genocide, rather than being abhorrent crimes against humanity, are becoming policy options in the remaking of the Middle East. Protesters have publicly expressed their positions at risk and cost to themselves. There's many examples of this. The interns at the progressive magazine The Nation wrote in opposition to its editorial endorsing Kamala Harris for U.S. President in the 2024 election. Interns for a magazine are chosen and they work at the pleasure of the editors. Their future careers in the highly competitive field of journalism are influenced by the recommendations they receive or the lack of such. The interns not only disagreed with their magazine's editors, they also criticized them for not signing their editorial endorsement of Harris. The interns wrote, "We do not support Donald Trump, but to champion Harris at this moment is to ignore the atrocities that are being carried out with weapons supplied by the Biden-Harris administration. Since she effectively became the Democratic nominee, Harris has failed to differentiate her policies from Joe Biden's blank check support for genocide. It is in seeking to follow their lead that we as journalists refuse to support Harris. When we think of her, we do not think of the redemption of American democracy. We think of mangled bodies, press jackets buried with shredded remains in shoe boxes, hospital patients still attached to their IVs, burning alive, grieving mothers wailing until they pass out, the haunted eyes of a Palestinian prisoner. We think of pigtails and lifeless eyes, the smell of rot over mass graves, bodies without heads. We think of ashes, dust, and blood." In 2024, Anna Maria Mohadino went beyond speaking out against her employer. She resigned from her position as an intern-based freelancer at CNN International. This was not easy for her since like everyone, she had bills to pay and personal aspirations for her future in journalism. Nevertheless, she wrote in her resignation letter that pro-Israeli rhetoric at CNN is far too deep-rooted and unwilling to change fast enough to stop what is now a genocide of the Palestinian people. She found it to be immoral to continue in her position at CNN. There's a wide spectrum of opinion among Jewish Americans. Well-known Jewish intellectuals and organizations, including Jewish Voice for Peace, Jewish Peace Lobby, Students for Justice in Palestine, If Not Now, and other organizations, expressed opposition to Israeli policy and called for an end to Israel's oppression of Palestinians. At a Seder in the Street event on April 23, 2024, held near Senator Chuck Schumer's residence, the Jewish author Naomi Klein spoke about the contemporary meaning of Passover. "I've been thinking about Moses," she said, "and his rage when he came down from the mount to find the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. The eco-feminist in me was always uneasy about this story. What kind of God is jealous of animals? What kind of God wants to hoard all the sacredness of the earth for himself? But there is a less literal way of understanding the story. It is about false idols, about the human tendency to worship the profane and the shiny, to look to the small and the material rather than the large and transcendent. What I want to say to you tonight at this revolutionary and historic Seder in the streets is that too many of our people are worshiping a false idol once again. They are enraptured by it, drunk on it, profaned by it, and that false idol is called Zionism." Beginning in the spring of 2024, the example of students setting up pro-Palestinian tent camps on the campus of Columbia University spread across more than 100 other colleges and universities. About 18% of these encampments ended with the universities agreeing to at least some of the protester student demands to divest from Israel and companies that support Israel. Most were forcibly disbanded by local or campus officials. For example, on April 30th, Columbia's leadership authorized a New York Police Department sweep of the campus to clear protesters who were barricaded in Hamilton Hall and in the Gaza Solidarity encampment. Police arrested dozens of protesters, slammed them with barricades, and threw protesters down the stairs. In one case, according to the Columbia Spectator, the university's student newspaper, police would not allow any other media organizations or outside observers to be there. On the other side of the country, on April 30th, a group of pro-Israeli activists attacked a pro-Palestinian encampment at UCLA. Security guards were at the scene but did not intervene for hours. In October, 3 of the pro-Israeli activists were arrested on felony charges and another for misdemeanor. One had used tear gas, another a metal pipe. Law enforcement had stood by for hours as counter-protesters attacked the pro-Palestinian encampment at UCLA on October 30th, which erupted into the worst violence stemming from the ongoing college protests around the country over Israel's war in Gaza. In addition to enduring aggressive arrests and attack by pro-Israeli thugs, pro-Palestinian protesters often were denied their diplomas at graduation ceremonies. Others had their names publicized to encourage pro-Israeli employers not to hire them in a process referred to as doxing. In addition to The Nation and CNN interns and progressive Jewish American organizations and many other U.S. students, a number of Biden administration officials have resigned due to their opposition to U.S. policy towards Gaza and Israel. Josh Paul, who resigned from the State Department, and others went on to organize an effort to change U.S. policy. voluntarily leaving one's careers and accepting the costs of that decision is due to personal commitment is heroic. The most recent State Department resignation came to light as of this presentation is that of Mike Casey, who was the State Department's deputy political counselor in Gaza. He resigned in July of 2024, but this only became known here in December of 2024. He said, quote, "I got so tired of writing about dead kids, just constantly having to prove to Washington that these children actually died, and then watching nothing happened. Among the discouragements came when the casualty numbers in Gaza that he had documented were publicly questioned by Gaza." Again, quote, "I was the one writing the reports. What's the point of me writing this stuff if you're just going to disregard it? We don't have a policy on Palestine. We just do what the Israelis want us to do," he said. The White House National Security Council did not comment on the resignation. Israel's spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did comment, saying, "We see no need to respond to baseless accusations stemming solely from the frustration of a former employee." Two American Jewish leaders, Simon Zimmerman and Eitan, went beyond a critique of Israeli policies to an effort to redefine Judaism's relationship with Israel, revealing a deepening generational divide over modern Jewish identity. Some accused these two filmmakers of being self-hating Jews. Zimmerman and Eitan challenged the views of a Jewish nationalism, and they call in their movie Israelism for a return to a much longer-standing Jewish set of values of justice and tikkun olam, or the commitment to heal the world. Protesters were not only against U.S. policy, they were also in favor of U.S. policy living up to the best of the American tradition. The 1776 Declaration of Independence affirmed the truth that all people are created with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not a policy that led to tens of thousands of deaths, forced occupation, and the despair for month after month of U.S. arms raining down on defenseless citizens. It spoke to a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, not the endless diplomatic protection of a nation whose policies were overwhelmingly opposed by most United Nations members. The United States Constitution stated that its purpose was to include establishing justice, not the injustice of being complicit in ethnic cleansing and genocide. The United States rightly celebrates Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation call that all persons held enslaved shall henceforth and forever be free, not the denial of freedom and dignity and self-determination of Palestinians. For all of his many problems, Woodrow Wilson, too, is properly celebrated for his assertion in his address to Congress of January 18, 1918, that the day of conquest and aggrandizement is gone, that the United States desires a just and stable peace such as can be secured only by the removing the chief provocation to war. This stood in stark contrast to a U.S. ally's conquest of Gaza and the West Bank, and to the occupation and assaults on them. The United States rightly takes pride in its central role in the Geneva Conventions after the Second World War, with their intent to alleviate the sufferings caused by war and their desire to protect both captured soldiers and civilians during war, not to abuse enemy combatants and entire populations. Many Americans saw Jimmy Carter as our best former president for his many human rights efforts throughout his post-White House years. In his book about Palestine, which called for peace, not apartheid, he says that protesters wanted U.S. policy to Palestine to be consistent with his advice. Instead, the increased occupation of the West Bank has worsened apartheid. On January 26, 2024, the International Court of Justice ruled that it is plausible that Israel has committed acts of violence and that the International Court of Justice also ordered Israel to take steps to prevent genocide. The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken denounced Israel for being referred to in the ICJ document for alleged genocide during its war on Gaza, calling the claim meritless and without factual basis. On March 5, 2024, 210 members of the U.S. House of Representatives signed a letter addressed to Biden and Blinken affirming U.S. support for Israel in response to the ICJ's, quote, meritless and counterproductive case. On May 20th, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, A.A. Khan, told the court, quote, I have reasonable grounds to believe that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense of Israel, bear criminal responsibility for the following war crimes and crimes against humanity committed on the territory of the State of Palestine and the Gaza Strip from at least 8th of October 2023. They're guilty of starvation of civilians, willfully causing great suffering or bodily injury to health, willful killing, intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population as a war crime, extermination as a crime against humanity, persecution as a crime against humanity, and other humane acts as crimes against humanity. Secretary of State Antony Blinken retorted the United States fundamentally rejects the announcement today from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that he is applying for arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials together with warrants for Hamas terrorists. We reject the prosecutor's equivalence of Israel with Hamas. It is shameful, Blinken said. When the ICC's prosecutor first recommended that the court issue these warrants, President Joe Biden said, quote, the ICC prosecutor's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders is outrageous. On June 4th, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution calling for sanctions against the ICC. The act included, quote, the ICC's actions against Israel are illegitimate and baseless, including the preliminary examination and investigation of Israel and applications for arrest warrants against Israeli officials, which create a damaging precedent which threatens the United States, Israel, and all the United States partners who have not submitted to the ICC's jurisdiction. On November 21st of 2024, the ICC unanimously adopted the prosecutor's request and issued warrants for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the former now Israeli Minister of Defense. President Biden's response was unchanged since May. On November 21st, that same day, he says, quote, the ICC issuance of arrest warrants against Israeli leaders is outrageous. Let me be clear once again. Whatever the ICC might imply, there is no equivalence, none, between Israel and Hamas. We will always stand with Israel against threats to its security. In November of 2024, the Pope called for an investigation into whether Israel's actions constitute genocide in Gaza. Then in December, the Vatican hosted a nativity scene in which baby Jesus was lying on a keffiyeh at the national symbol for the Palestinians. U.S. officials made no response to the Pope's statements, but the Times of Israel has headlined the response with genocide comments, nativity visit, Pope sows doubt about commitment to Jews. Francis, who sees himself as a friend of the community, has had an increasingly patchy record on statements relating to Jews in Israel and may be causing irreversible damage to ties. End of quote. The International Jewish Committee on International Consultations called the claim Israel was committing genocide, quote, categorically false. The major human rights organization, Amnesty International, concluded on December 4th of 2024 that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The U.S. State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel rejected Amnesty's finding. Quote, "We disagree with the conclusions of such a report. We have previously and continue to find the allegations of genocide to be unfounded." On December 19th of 2024, Human Rights Watch found that Israel was guilty of extermination and acts of genocide by deliberately depriving Palestinians in Gaza of water. Patel again rejected the finding that Israel was guilty of committing genocide, saying that when it comes to determination of something like genocide, the legal standard is just incredibly high, and so the finding in this scenario we just disagree with. The ICJ found it plausible enough that Israel was committing genocide to go on to a full trial. The ICC issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. U.S. officials expressed opposition to these. The Pope called for an investigation as to whether or not Israel was committing genocide, to which the Biden administration remained silent. The major human rights organizations did find that Israel was guilty of genocide, and the United States administration rejected these findings. Instead of accepting the rulings of the world's highest courts and some of the most prominent human rights organizations, the Biden administration continued to strongly support Israel, routinely ignoring or rejecting that Israel was committing human rights violations. Shortly after the brutal Hamas attack of October 7th of 2023, Joe Biden flew to Israel on October 18th and greeted Netanyahu with a bear hug upon arrival to Ben Gurion International Airport. Over the next year, the United States sent some $18 billion of military aid to Israel. The U.S. was already committed to be sending about $3.8 billion per year through 2028 due to an Obama-era agreement. Since 1946, Israel is the top recipient of U.S. foreign aid, topping $300 billion. Much of the economic aid to Israel comes in the forms of credits that Israel can use to buy arms from the United States. The country imports about 78% of its arms from the U.S. These include more than 50 F-15 fighter jets, B-52 bombers, advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, or AMRAAMs, 120mm tank ammunition, and high-explosive mortars, tactical vehicles, and a wide range of other weapons. In October of 2024, the U.S. sent THAAD, or the Thermal High Altitude Area Defense Anti-Missile System, to Israel, along with U.S. military personnel needed to operate and repair it. In addition to all of this, the U.S. maintains an amphibious-ready group marine expeditionary unit, guided missile destroyers, aircraft carriers, and other Navy capabilities throughout the eastern Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Gulf of Oman. The United States provides vigorous diplomatic protection of Israel. As of December 2023, the U.S. had vetoed U.S. Security Council's resolutions that were critical of Israel 45 times, using its veto power more than any other member. While this ensures that no Security Council resolution of which is critical of Israel passes, the U.S. cannot stop overwhelming support by other members of such General Assembly resolutions. However, General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding, and so strong majority votes in the General Assembly can be safely ignored by Israel. American military and diplomatic support are based on American domestic institutional support. One indication of this was when Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress on July 24th of 2024. This was Netanyahu's fourth such address. Winston Churchill, in comparison, did so only 3 times. In his 2024 speech of 56 minutes, Netanyahu enjoyed 52 standing ovations. In this speech, Netanyahu said, like December 7, 1941 and September 11, 2001, October 7th is a day that will forever live in infamy. It was the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. It began as a perfect day, not a cloud in the sky. Thousands of young Israelis were celebrating at an outdoor music festival. And suddenly, at 6:29 a.m., as children were still sleeping soundly in their beds in towns in Kibbutzim next to Gaza, suddenly heaven turned into hell. 3,000 Hamas terrorists stormed into Israel. They butchered 1,200 people from 41 countries, including 39 Americans. Proportionally, compared to our population, that's like 20 9/11s in one day. And these monsters, they raped women, they beheaded men, they burned babies alive, they killed parents in front of their children and children in front of their parents. They dragged 255 people, both living and dead, into the dark dungeons. The Israeli Prime Minister did not mention that Israel was then holding thousands of political prisoners, often as so-called administrative detainees without charge. B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, reported in September of 2024 that at the end of 2024, the Israeli Prison Service was holding 3,340 Palestinians in administrative detention. Amnesty International reported that the Israeli Prison Service informed human rights group Hamote that as of 1st of November it is holding 6,809 Palestinian prisoners. It went on to report about Israel's, quote, inhuman and degrading treatment of prisoners, and that it failed to investigate incidents of torture and death in custody. In his speech to Congress, Netanyahu did not mention that before October 7th of 2023, some 700,000 Palestinians were driven into Gaza in 1948, that Israel captured Gaza in 1967, occupied it until 2025, disengaged in 2005, but set up a blockade in 2007, creating an open-air prison, blockaded it and kept it as such after 2007. It invaded Gaza in 2008 and 2009 with over 1,000 Palestinian deaths and the destruction of many homes, schools, and hospitals. In 2012, an invasion leading to 100 Palestinian deaths was carried out. In 2014, an Israeli invasion of Gaza resulted in the deaths of 73 Israelis, mostly soldiers, and 2,251 Palestinians, mostly civilians, and the destruction of 25% of the homes in Gaza City and 75% of the homes in Bet Hanun, or a 2021 crisis that saw 256 Palestinians and 15 Israelis killed. These frequent invasions of Gaza were referred to in Israel as mowing the lawn, yet many continue to see the beginning of the Gaza crisis as having been begun on October 7th, 2023. By December of 2024, over 45,000 Palestinians had been reported as killed in the Israel-Hamas war, including over 17,000 children, over 150 journalists and media workers, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists, 120 academics, over 224 humanitarian workers, including 179 employees of UNRWA. Almost certainly those numbers are much higher given the numbers of bodies unaccounted for under the rubble left by bombings. More than half of Gaza's homes were damaged or destroyed, as well as 80% of commercial facilities, 87% of school buildings, healthcare facilities, 17 of 36 hospitals are partially functional. 68% of road networks are destroyed. 68% of cropland is destroyed. Israel has issued more than 65 evacuation orders for Gaza's 2.3 million people. The level of destruction and the statements made by Israeli officials and IDF soldiers and others has led many to suspect that Israeli objectives in the assault on Gaza were more than recovering hostages and defeating Hamas. For example, the Times of Israel reported in October of 2024 that the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir had called for the reestablishment of settlements in the Gaza Strip and says that, quote, encouraging emigration, end quote, of the Palestinian population from the territory was, quote, the most ethical, unquote, solution for the current conflict. Quote, if we want to, we can renew settlement in Gaza. We can also do something else, encourage immigration. The truth is, this is the most ethical and the most correct solution. Oblivious to what was going on, he assured his listeners that this would be done, quote, not by force, and that the Gazans would merely be made aware of how Israel was, quote, giving them the option, end quote, of going to other countries. The land of Israel, apparently including Gaza, is ours, he asserted. As the Israeli assault on Gaza and the West Bank wore on, U.S. policy remained unwaveringly supportive of Israel, even while U.S. public opinion changed. The Gallup opinion polls reported that 45% of Americans disapproved of Israeli military action in Gaza in November 2023, but by the following March in 2024, that had risen to 55%. Approval of Israeli actions had fallen from 50% to 36%. Still, U.S. policymakers across the mainstream spectrum maintained their support of Israel. Kamala Harris did not permit the pro-Palestinian speaker to take the podium at the Democratic National Convention. In her speech, she said, quote, let me be clear, I will always stand out for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure that Israel has the ability to defend itself because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October the 7th, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival. Miriam Adelson, who, like her deceased husband, is a strong supporter of Israel, gave $100 million to the Trump campaign. She said that Trump is a true friend and will, quote, save the Jewish people, unquote. Trump told a group of Israeli supporters, quote, you have a big protector in me. You don't have a protector on the other side. Trump also accused Harris of pandering to Hamas' supporters and said, quote, Jewish people have no excuse for supporting his Democratic rival. Trump told the Israeli-American Council Summit in Washington, D.C. that you have a big supporter in me, you don't have a protector on the other side. And as it's turned out, he's been true to his word once he's been elected. He's quickly compiled what has been called one of the most pro-Israel teams of any administration in history. One of the many examples of Christian Zionists in Congress is that of Doug Lamport, who's a Republican from Colorado. One of the reasons he cites for his lifelong support of Israel is, quote, For me, faith provides a compelling factor in supporting Israel. I became a believer when I was 18 and a freshman in college. Putting aside my previous skepticism, I came to the point where I knew I needed something more in life. A part of my newfound Christianity, I discovered and believed the truth of Scripture. Genesis 12:1-3 is a foundational text for both Judaism and Christianity. In these verses, God promises that Abram will become a great nation. Those who bless Abram's descendants will be blessed, and those who curse his descendants will be cursed. For people of faith like myself, this compels me to support Israel. So we have a number of cases where people in Congress, much less in the executive branch, are highly supportive of Israel, even though public opinion has changed over time. To develop this notion of Christian Zionism, let's just recall that Elon Pape, in his excellent new book, notes that Zionism began in Britain as an evangelical Christian concept and later as an active project. And then Christian Zionism went on to influence American religion and politics. Over the past 2,500 years, Jews and Christians have each developed a range of interpretations of their sacred scriptures, and both have sometimes added to how we can draw from and add to what we inherit from the past. One topic for Christians has been the relationship of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, to the New Testament. Do prophecies made in the Old Testament foretell Jesus of Nazareth, who would live many centuries later, or is it better to accept the Jewish prophets concerned with their own times? Are the prophets speaking to their own communities at their time, or are they predicting a distant future of the world? Are words to be taken literally or symbolically? Where is the Bible historical or mythical? For example, does Jerusalem refer to a city or to the Christian church? Is the entire Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments, a single, coherent, dictated word of God? Is it a complex collection of writings and editings by many Jewish people over centuries? Christians such as John Hagee, who formed the Christians United for Israel, or CUFI, leans towards the position that the entire Bible is to be taken more literally and historically rather than symbolically and metaphorically. The Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, includes text in which God is said to have promised certain land to the Hebrew people. In Genesis 15, verse 18, it says, On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Cushites, and the Jebusites. In Exodus 23, verse 31, it says, I will set the borders from the Red Sea of the Philistines and from the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will hand over to you the inhabitants of the land, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not live in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will certainly be a snare to you. And then in Numbers 34, starting with verse 1, we have additional specific territorial boundaries to the so-called Promised Land. Add this all together, and the Lord is said to have promised the Hebrew all of what is now considered to be Palestinian territories: Western Syria, Southern Turkey, part of Iraq, part of Saudi Arabia, part of Egypt and Lebanon. Another way to look at the text is that it was written and edited by Hebrews who gave expression to their views. In this sense, the Bible is human words about God and other topics, not the single word of God. Another aspect of the Genesis 15 text and the Exodus text that is in regards to the right of land. One common current in interpretation is that modern Israel is a settler colonial state that lacks right to its land. In this interpretation, right comes from first settlement. Indigenous people have a right to the land they live on. And the argument then becomes, well, who are the indigenous peoples? And the argument really is that the settler colonial position takes is that even if the people did not originally evolve there, if they've lived there for centuries, even millennia, they become indigenous peoples. So it's been difficult to figure this all out because who are the indigenous peoples almost anywhere in the world, except in Africa, where we're told peoples first evolved. But it's certainly in the Middle East and in Palestine, it's been populated by many groups over millennia, and they've often supplanted or intermixed with each other. So it's hard to identify the ancestors of people who've been living in the Middle East, who are the first peoples to have settled that particular land. Genesis 15 gives no right to the indigenous or long-standing populations. Right to land comes from the Lord granting it. And God promises to Abram and his descendants the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, and all of the other ites, that they can be driven off. There were already lots of people living on the land before Abram, according to the text, and the Lord gives that land to the Hebrews. God made the world, and he can take and give it to whom he chooses. On the other hand, if the texts were written by ancient Hebrews, putting words into the mouth of the God that they imagined, then these texts currently hold little weight. So we have a debate, obviously, about what the Bible means and how we should interpret the whole idea of settler colonialism. But if you take the Bible as the Word of God, then the God who created the universe promised all of this land that had been previously settled by indigenous peoples, and that is not what gives them the right to the land. The indigenous peoples don't have a right to the land because they're indigenous. The land belongs to those to whom it's been given to by God. Then there's the question about what do the texts in the Bible say about the use of force? How should we interpret the Exodus stories and the conquest of Canaan stories? Are they history or myth, or is there some mixture of that? They contain kernels of history, but written long after the events they discuss for purposes that authors and editors were addressing in their own time. These are complicated questions beyond our full examination here, but it's worth at least remembering that one interpretation of the Exodus story, for example, where you have Egyptian slaves, Hebrew slaves working for their Egyptian masters, that their liberation from Egypt is a story which stresses that God makes a preferential option for the poor and the oppressed. And that's what we should take from the Exodus story. But when you read the text, it's not that difficult to make a very different interpretation of the use of force for holy purposes. In the Exodus story, God, sometimes called Yahweh or El, Israel, takes an active interest in the liberation of his people from slavery in Egypt. He sends Moses to persuade Pharaoh to let his people go. Persuasion didn't work. Moses turns his staff into a snake, but Pharaoh's magicians can do that trick too. So tougher policies need to be carried out. Genesis 7 begins the story of the plagues. The first is when the Lord tells Moses that the Lord will turn the Nile River into blood. Quote, the fish in the river will die, the river will stink, the Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. End quote. There is really no other abundant source of water in the Egyptian desert, so this is a denial of water to Egypt. Genesis 8:20 and following tells the story of the plague of the flies. All over Egypt, the flies destroyed the land. Then the account describes how all the livestock of the Egyptians died as a result. Then in Genesis 9, the painful boils covered the bodies of all Egyptians. A tremendous hailstorm fell all over Egypt. It beat down on people and animals alike. It struck down everything growing in the fields of Egypt. And then came the locusts, which ate anything in the field that the hail had not already destroyed. Moses then says, quote, the Lord says, about midnight I will go through every part of Egypt. Every oldest son in Egypt will die. The oldest son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne will die. The oldest son of every female slave who works at her handmill will die. All the male animals born first to their mothers among the cattle will also die. There will be loud crying all over Egypt. And it goes on to report the quote, at midnight the Lord struck down every oldest son in Egypt. He killed the oldest son of Pharaoh who sat on the throne. He killed all the oldest sons of prisoners. He also killed all the male animals born first to their mothers among the livestock. Pharaoh and all his Egypt got up during the night, and so did all the Egyptians. There was loud crying in Egypt because someone had died in every home. These texts from Genesis seem to be consistent with the infamous statement by Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who said on October 9th, 2023, that, quote, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed, end quote. And if one has to choose between international humanitarian law that prohibits such wholesale attack on civilian populations and the Word of God who created the universe, doesn't the latter take precedence? The next part of the story describes how God kills Pharaoh's charioteers. This is in Genesis 14. The use of force by God is not this time against human and animals firstborn, but against military targets. After this, God commands his people to use force to conquer the promised land from its earlier inhabitants, and frequently blesses their fighting. In Leviticus 26, the Lord commands that the Hebrews, quote, chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. In Numbers 31, verses 7 to 12, it describes how the Hebrews, quote, warred against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses, and slew every male. And the people of Israel took captive the women of Midian and their little ones, and they took as booty all their cattle, their flocks, and all their goods. All their cities and the places where they dwelt, and all their encampments they burned with fire, and took all the spoil and all the booty, both of man and of beast. Then they brought the captives and the booty and the spoil to Moses and to Eleazar the priest. And Moses was angry with the officers of the army. Now, Moses, end quote, Moses was not angry because they had killed and stolen, which seems to violate the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal. He's not angry that they violated those commandments. Instead, he asks, quote, have you let all the women live? And he adds in verses 16 to 18, quote, "Behold, these caused the people of Israel by the counsel of Balaam to act treacherously against the Lord in the matter of Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves." End quote. In verses 25 to 29, Moses then goes on and explains how everyone, including the Lord, should get their portion of the booty. In other words, thou shalt kill, and thou shalt steal, and thou shalt keep some of the virgins for your own use. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3, the Lord Almighty says, quote, "Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." End quote. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the Israelis were united in their fight against Hamas, whom he described as the enemy of incomparable cruelty. Quote, he says, "They are committed to completely eliminating this evil from the world." This is what the IDF needs to do. Netanyahu said in Hebrew, he then added, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you," says our Holy Bible, and we do remember. Regarding providing aid to Israel and obligations for non-Israelis to do this, Isaiah 60 lays out a prophet's hope for the future. It says, "The abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. The nations shall bring their gold and frankincense. Foreigners shall build up your walls. Your gates shall always be open. Day and night they shall not be shut, so that the nations shall bring you their wealth. For the nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. Those nations shall be utterly laid to waste." So the total holy war of the Torah and the statements of senior Israeli leaders were picked up by the Israeli Defense Forces as it fought in Gaza. One battalion posted its mission as nothing less than the systematic, concerted, and deliberate effort to erase the intellectual, cultural, and social future of the Palestinian people. Our job is to flatten Gaza. The soldiers at the official D-19 Company of Israel's 749th Combat Engineering Battalion wrote on their Instagram page. And they added accurately, "No one will stop us." So Genesis says that the Lord God told Abraham, as we noted before, said, "I will bless those who bless you. I will put a curse on anyone who puts a curse on you." Christian Zionists take from all of this that they must support the modern Jewish state in the Promised Land. They support the United States building up Israel's walls and keeping its gates open, meaning that to provide for its defense to the point that they need not even close the gates at night when there used to be threats, but now there's no more threats to its security. Israel will be so overwhelmingly powerful that there is no threat, and untold wealth will be brought, gold and frankincense, in the words of Isaiah, will be brought to Egypt, and Christian Zionists support bringing this level of wealth of the United States to Israel, and God will bless the United States for blessing Israel. The Christian Zionists hope and pray. And it's worth remembering that in the United States, there are many more Christian Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists. They support Israel for different reasons, but in those numbers. Well, anyway, Christian Zionists are clearly an important reason for why the United States supports Israel. AIPAC and the Israel lobby, of which the Christian Zionists are a part, are another part. And when biblical texts are insufficient to persuade people to support Israel, organizations, money, and political power can fill in the gaps. And there's many lobbying groups in favor of Israel. Among the most effective is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. AIPAC is so successful in part due to its insightful analysis of American politics. Its members realize that elected public representatives want to get reelected. If representatives support what AIPAC does, they often get money. And if they deviate from what AIPAC prefers in almost any way, they might well find themselves with well-funded opponents and organized opposition. Once in office, they are contacted regularly with AIPAC representatives to keep them apprised of AIPAC's positions and what is expected of them. One example of an AIPAC supporter is Joe Biden. He's made his Irish Catholic identity well known. He's also said that, quote, "You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. I am a Zionist." In addition to his being a Christian Zionist, he's also a top recipient of pro-Israeli campaign donations from 1990 to 2024. That totaled over $4 million. The donors have received a pretty good return on their investment. On the other hand, congressional representatives such as Jamal Bowman of New York and Cori Bush of Missouri, who were strong pro-Palestinian supporters, learned the hard way about the costs of opposing AIPAC's views. Opponent candidates in the primaries were identified and encouraged to run, and AIPAC spent some $100 million in the 2024 elections in order to support candidates who were intended to defeat the pro-Palestinian ones. And as their website asserts, every AIPAC endorsed candidate won. Bowman and Bush lost. In 2018, the Associated Press found that the mainstream U.S. media reported Israeli deaths at a rate of nearly 4 times greater than Palestinian ones. So in addition to Christian Zionists and to AIPAC and other pro-Israeli lobbies, we have the media seemingly to favor, not exclusively, but significantly, the Israeli cause. Just more reports, more specific reports, more interviews of those in Israel who have suffered from Palestinian use of force. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, said in December of 2024, "This genocide in Gaza," she said, "would not have been possible without the shocking cover-up by the media. The role that corporate media played in justifying crimes and spreading misinformation is what she's criticizing." She added that, quote, "The role of international media, of Western media, in acting in defense of the acts of a genocidal state, this is unprecedented, but it's also revealing of the global situation we are facing. Had it not been for independent media in the West, particularly in the West, in fact, we wouldn't know much about what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territory." Another example of the tensions within the media regarding this question is the interview on CBS Mornings of a major African-American intellectual, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Tony DeCoupiel, one of the 3 interviewers, aggressively questioned the author of The Message, Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, which includes a section critical of Israel's apartheid and the Jim Crow style of treating Palestinians. subsequent backlash against his aggressive interviewing of the guest on CBS Mornings led many viewers of CBS to criticize their employee. And some leaders of CBS criticized him as well. However, the chair of Paramount Global, Sherry Redstone, who spoke in favor of the interviewer, and Paramount Global is a major stockholder in CBS. She said, "I frankly think Tony did a great job with that interview." As the Hollywood Reporter stated, Paramount Global Chair and National Amusements President Sherry Redstone is one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. She's also an observant Jew and a supporter of Israel who has been reeling in the days since October 7th when Hamas terrorists attacked the Jewish state. So we have Christian Zionists, the Israel lobby with groups such as AIPAC and many others, perhaps certain aspects of media coverage regarding Israel and Gaza, and we have Congress as one of the players in this. Pat Buchanan said back in the 90s that Capitol Hill is Israel's occupied territory. That's a bit of inflammatory rhetoric, but consistent on overwhelming votes in favor of Israel in Congress are pretty factual. Whether due to personal conviction or calculations about how to benefit from currying favor, Representative Elise Stefanik, who's a Republican from New York, led a congressional investigation of alleged anti-Semitism in American universities. Presidents and other university leaders from Harvard, MIT, the University of Pennsylvania, and others were called to testify. Due in part to their lawyerly but politically tone-deaf performances, the presidents of Harvard, Penn, Columbia, and others ended up resigning. Columbia President Manu Shafiq hung on to her job until August of 2024, but she finally resigned when she realized that she could not navigate between the pro-Israeli congressional demands and many pro-Palestinian Columbia students and faculty members. Large and hence influential donors also pressured their university leaders to resign, threatening to withhold or transfer their donations. The University of Michigan fired Rachel Dawson, who's a director of its diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. She had said in a private conversation that, quote, "The university is controlled by wealthy Jews. We don't work with Jews because they are wealthy and privileged and take care of themselves. Rich donors and Jewish board members control the presidents and silence students from the Middle Eastern and North Africa." While there was no recording of these comments, and they might have been paraphrased by others, the Michigan chapter of the Anti-Defamation League complained to the university of her anti-Semitic remarks, and she ended up being fired. Firing of university officials accused of being anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, or anti-Semitic were combined with rules fashioned over the summer of 2024 to reduce pro-Palestinian demonstrations at universities in the new 2024-25 academic year, and the results were effective. Since the frequent pro-Palestinian university demonstrations in the spring of 2024, universities successfully strategized how to limit these expressions in the fall. And an example of this is when some Harvard University students and professors silently put pro-Palestinian signs on library tables. They ended up being banned from the libraries. Tents that were to be held or kept up overnight were banned. And the effect was significant. There was a marked decline in pro-Palestinian protests here in the fall relative to the previous spring. Of course, the Israel lobby does face limits on its influence. It is not an all-powerful conspiracy. And given the public change of opinion on Israel's use of force in Gaza and elsewhere, the lobby had to spend a lot more money in the 2024 U.S. elections than had been required before to get the same results. The lobby's actions against Jamal Bowman, Coates, Claudine Gay, and others, all of whom are black, Cori Bush, this exacerbated already uneven Jewish-black relations. Bipartisan support for Israel has been diminished by the rise of a progressive Democratic Party minority, which is critical of Israeli policy. And you could say that Israeli policy has done more for the change in U.S. public opinion than the old BDS movement ever had, the boycott, divestiture, and sanctions movement. And the lobbies had to work overtime to combat that. So it's more difficult, and they have been only partially effective in influence public opinion. But certainly they've been very effective in maintaining U.S. policy support. So could anything diminish U.S. support for Israel? It's often been said that the U.S. could stop anything it objected to in Israeli policy immediately by cutting off military aid and diplomatic protection of Israel. But rather than doing this, the Biden administration continued both, even as it objected to Israeli policy. This made the U.S. look hypocritical or just pathetically dominated by its tiny ally. With the election of Donald Trump, his nominations of strongly pro-Israel cabinet secretaries, ambassadors, and other officials, Republican majorities in Congress, and the continued majority of the Democratic Party being supportive of Israel, U.S. support for Israel's policies seems to have become even more pronounced now than it was under the Biden administration. In fact, for many, the election in 2024 was a choice between ongoing disaster or catastrophic change, and catastrophic change won. One long-term possibility for U.S. reduction of support of Israel may come at some point when the U.S. no longer has the resources to maintain its enormous defense expenditures, not just in Israel but around the world. The 2024 U.S. military budget was about $916 billion, which is more than the next top national defense budgets of the next 9 countries. The U.S. budgetary crisis may make such continued defense expenditures, including military to Israel, just impossible in the future. The U.S. public debt now stands at a historic high of over $36 trillion. The debt was just over $4 trillion in 1993. That debt is 123% of U.S. GDP, the highest since the Second World War when it reached 106%. At current levels of increase, this is expected to become 172% of GDP by 2054. In 2023, the federal government spent $658 billion on net interest costs on the national debt. That total, which grew by 38% from $476 billion in 2022, was the largest amount ever spent on interest in the budget and could total 2.4% of the gross domestic product. Interest costs are on track to become the largest category of spending in the federal budget. By September of 2023, interest payments had gone up to over $1 trillion, up 30% at the same time the year before. That is more than the U.S. spends on defense or Medicare. Over the next 10 years, the U.S. will pay some almost $13 trillion in interest payments that could have been spent on healthcare, social programs, education, or defense, and so on. By 2053, interest payments will consume almost 40% of the government's revenue. It may just be too expensive for available U.S. resources to keep up its aid to Israel and all of its other military expenditures. It's possible that if interest rates rise, some may not wish to continue this military aid, even if it is somewhat theoretically possible. It may become increasingly apparent how U.S. support for wars benefiting Israel, which has cost trillions of dollars. The war in Iraq alone cost some $3 trillion, just is no longer affordable. As these programs perhaps may get squeezed out by interest payments, there may be increased social dislocation in the United States. There's been considerable interest in the United States about political polarization, in which political opponents are often see each other as enemies rather than as just people with whom they have some policy disagreements. And perhaps some people have worried that this could descend into civil war. There was a movie called Civil War that was in the U.S. theaters in 2024. There's been quite a few books that have come out on the topic. This was more of a fear if Trump had lost the 2024 elections. His followers had assaulted Congress after he lost in 2020, and they remain persuaded that if he had lost, it would have been due to a rigged election. And since there are more guns than people in the United States, there was a fear of a disloyal opposition that would not accept a loss at the ballot box. Democrats, in fact, lost the election, and they've behaved more like a loyal opposition in which they accept electoral defeat and they are struggling with how to do better in the 2026 midterm and 2028 general elections. But social unrest or even civil war certainly would curtail U.S. interventions abroad. And at some point, like every other empire in world history, the American empire will come to an end. And sometimes they come to an end abruptly after a long period of decline. On the other hand, people have been talking about this for a long time, and it hasn't yet come to pass. And this is a rather seemingly still a long-term hope. As rather than the collapse of U.S. support for Israel, at least for the foreseeable future, it looks like it's becoming even stronger under Trump than it was under Biden. This is a little bit beyond our topic here, but U.S. opposition to Assad in Syria has is associated with this since by toppling Assad, it breaks the conduit from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, so that Iran can no longer support Hezbollah in the way that they were doing before, and that many have seen sort of the remaking of the Middle East. So if anything, there seems to be a success of a rather old policy goal. General Wesley Clark reported that shortly after 9/11, he had seen the Pentagon plans that were aiming to take out the governments of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, the Sudan, and Iran over the next 5 years. And that Jeffrey Sachs says that Benjamin Netanyahu had been listing these countries as early as 1995. It took more than 5 years to do that, but by 2024, 6 of the 7 countries had had largely been turned into fragmented and more chaotic countries. And the last one, Iran, had been weakened. And the question now is if Donald Trump would be enticed to attack Iran directly, which Netanyahu has been calling for some time. So the question is if this successful remaking of the Middle East is showing that the goals of the Christian Zionists and the Jewish Zionists and the Israeli lobby have succeeded in supporting Israel's transformation of the role of ethnic cleansing and genocide from being abhorrent crimes against humanity into being possible policy tools to transform the Middle East and to achieve the objectives of getting a greater Israel intact. So, of course, this is an ongoing issue. Whatever is said at this moment is going to be eclipsed by news by the day after. So we'll all be following where this is headed. But at the very least, for increasing numbers of U.S. Public opinion, there's been distress about the complicity of the U.S. in Israel's ethnic cleansing and genocide, and yet American policy has remained firm.